Good afternoon. I'm sorry for the slight delay because of the technical issues here.
No, it's absolutely fine. Myself, Ramesh Saraugi, President of Bharat Chamber, and on my left side, Mr. Naresh Pachishya, and on my right side, Saurabh Khemani. We three of us are here physically, rest of the members have joined virtually.
Okay.
So, with your permission, do we start?
Yes, I'm ready. You can start.
Yeah. Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, members of the chamber, guests and friends. I welcome you all to today's exclusive e-session themed Recovery, Renewal and Resurgence of the Indian Economy, to be addressed by Dr. V. Anant Nageswaran, Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, this afternoon. It is my most pleasant duty to extend a very warm and hearty welcome to Dr. Nageswaran to our midst. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you, Dr. Nageswaran, on your appointment as the 18th Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Sir, we are grateful to you for sparing some of your valuable time to address us. Friends, Dr. Nageswaran, an alumnus of IIM Ahmedabad, earned his doctoral degree in finance from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, USA. Prior to his appointment as the Chief Economic Advisor, he has served as a part-time member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council for 2 years. Friends, I would like to briefly make a few observations to provoke the thoughts of Dr. Nageswaran, to provide him with more time. He will address us and thereafter we will have some interactions. Sir, I would first make one or two observations on the Economic Survey 2021-22. The survey clearly reveals the government's optimism on growth for financial year 23. At the same time, it appears to be conservative as compared to the estimates released by multilateral organizations and rating agencies, because in the earlier survey, growth projections were made in double-digit figures. Now, the question before us is how the growth rate of 8 to 8.5% are to be achieved, with challenges persisting on demand growth, such as job losses and unemployment resulting from the pandemic. Since no observable incentives to consumption demand has been announced in the last two budget proposals, it is unclear about the government's approach towards raising the disposable income of the people, especially the middle class. Sir, I would request you to deliberate on the methods that may put more money in the hands of people in the short run when actually prices are sticky. I would like to highlight that income inequality in India has risen through the years and has been further aggravated by the pandemic, with vulnerable groups being largely affected. According to data from the World Inequality Database, the possession of wealth of the top 1% of India increased from 16.1% in 1991 to 31.7% in 2020. On the other hand, the proportion of wealth of the bottom 50% of the population declined from 8.8% in 1991 to 6% in 2020. It is feared the divergence of income and wealth inequality will have dire implications on the long-term health of the economy. directly affecting growth prospects in recovery periods. I would request your views on the prospective policy decisions that presently exist and are to be devised in the near future for narrowing the income gap. The survey has cautioned on the impending threats to macroeconomic stability from overseas developments, mostly arising from high inflation and rise in crude oil prices. Now, the looming threat remains that costlier imports of crude oil and related products are likely to widen the current account deficit and weaken the rupee further. Furthermore, policy normalization in developed economies worldwide may result in capital flight, bringing down forex reserves. I would request you, sir, to present your discourse regarding the rising gap between retail and wholesale inflation. Is India equipped to make policy responses to counter the perils from inflation and other overseas developments? The Central Budget 2022 is definitely growth oriented and futuristic. It embraces access to different levels of technology with digital adoption. Introduction of a new digital rupee, which is a central bank digital currency, digitalization of post offices and school education at grassroots levels are some of the most laudable initiatives. The question before us is how these are going to be matched with requisite pool of skilled personnel, since most of these programs on skills continue to make the turnouts unemployable. Another important issue in this context is that the vision document released by the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology projecting India's manufacturing capacity in electronics to reach US $300 billion by 2026 from the current level of US $75 billion. Accomplishment in this regard is, however, subject to resolving the challenges related to infrastructure, tariffs, and free trade agreements. As the document has emphasized, I feel these are the serious obstacles to growth in this sector. Sir, there is no doubt that your appointment has occurred at a time when the Indian economy is gradually gaining momentum for the recovery, renewal and resurgence. So my question to you, sir, is when you think we will become a US 5 trillion economy? Friends, as you may know, that Dr. Nageswaran is also an accomplished author and has penned quite a few books on economics and finance. In this regard, I would request you, sir, to send an autographed copy of one of your latest books, preferably The Rise of Finance, Causes, Consequences and Cures, to the Chamber for archival in its library. With these words, I would request Dr. Nageswaran to commence his address. Thank you. Dr. Nageswaran, please.
Yeah, thank you for those very kind words of introduction. And yes, I would certainly, it'll be my pleasure and privilege to share a copy of my book for the archives of the esteemed and august Bharat Chamber of Commerce. It might be a matter of satisfaction, I hope, to you, the distinguished office bearers on the dais and the distinguished members of the Bharat Chamber of Commerce, that this is the first formal non-governmental engagement that I am undertaking after being appointed as the Chief Economic Advisor. You had raised very pertinent issues and questions for which some of which do not have easy answers. I hope my presentation will address them to a large extent. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. These are my personal views and they do not necessarily represent the views of the government. I must make that very clear. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint presentation on the screen here uh, and hope you will be able to see them. Okay. I hope all of you are able to see the screen very well. Yeah? Is that screen clear, visible? Is the screen visible?
It's clear. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just give you an overview of where things stand as far as the world economy is concerned. So in the International Monetary Fund updates its forecast twice a year, April and October, every year, but also revises them slightly in January and July as well. So in January 2022, the International Monetary Fund brought down the estimate for the world economy to 4.4% from 4.9%. The world economic growth rate and price economy. For the year ending March 2022, the International Monetary Fund raised the forecast to from 8.5 to 9%. Even though after this forecast was published, India went through the Omicron third wave. By and large, we know that the third wave has been, thankfully, not as lethal and not as debilitating as the first or the second wave were. And therefore, even many private sector estimates do expect that the Indian economy will grow at 9%. The government's estimate, the Ministry of Statistics estimate is 9.2%. RBI also expects around 9 to 9.2% for the year ending March 2022, which will now happen in a month's time. So India is one of the exceptions where the forecast revision by the International Monetary Fund was on the upward direction. However, the inflation expectations, which you have talked about clearly and correctly about the purchasing power in the hands of the people, this has been a worldwide problem, not only due to the pandemic, but also due to, as many of you might know, and definitely be experiencing yourself, because of the container cost, shipping freight rates, crude oil price, industrial metals, aluminium, copper, etc. All these things have combined to create huge inflation pressure, also very low interest rates and money printing in the developed world. As you can see on the left-hand side, the advanced economies have very high inflation rate. In fact, the United States Consumer Price Index is around 7.5%. Indian inflation rates, as you might know, are around 5.2%. Now, obviously, in the last 1 week or so, the price of crude oil has gone up. And if these are eventually passed on to the consumer, there will be a slight increase in the inflation rate. But by and large, India's inflation rate should remain within the band of between 2 and 6%, but definitely more towards the higher end of the between 4 and 6%, which the Reserve Bank of India is targeting in the course of the next financial year. So this chart on your right shows you that India is not one of the economies. In fact, Turkey is not even in this chart. It is more than 20%. Brazil and Russia or even South Africa are slightly above. Only China's inflation rate is below India's inflation rate, and developed countries have a high inflation rate as well. It is a global phenomenon. And as you can see here, supply shocks explain half the increase in the prices in euro area. Factory closures and other supply problems have weighed heavily on GDP growth and manufacturing output in the euro area as well. So, as I mentioned, this is just to highlight that what we are not unique in facing a situation of uncertain growth and slightly persistent inflation rate. This is a global phenomena because of the nature of the pandemic and the impact it has had on many supply disruptions, because in many cases even people have not been able to come to work to drive trucks. And in the Western world, you might have also heard about the concerns with vaccination, and that has also affected, finding the crew members for shipping lines, for truck industry, etc. And the crude oil price, although this chart is supposed to be a daily chart, it is only updated until February 14th. There is a lag. But as you know very well, right now, the price of the Texas crude is roughly around $95, $96. And with the situation in Ukraine having escalated, this might go higher as well. The impact on the Indian economy, both for economic growth and inflation, will depend on not only the level to which the price goes up, but also how long does the price remain high. So, this is also we discussed along with the crude oil price, supply disruptions, freight prices went up, shipping liner prices went up, and also this is the on the right hand side what you see here is what is the transportation cost to ship something from China to the west coast of the US, China to Europe, etc., etc. You can see that only Europe to China, from Europe to China, the rates have remained the same, but whenever it is traveling from China towards the west or from the United States to China, the shipping rates have gone up more than 2x, 3 times, 6 times, 7 times, and even 10 times. And naturally, these are either passed on to consumers or absorbed by businesses, but we understand that lately many businesses in the Western countries have been passing on these prices. That is why the inflation rate in America, in Europe, and in the UK are between 5 and 7%. So this is the global backdrop. And also with respect to the US economy, because of the high inflation rate, the actual deposit rates, which are also an issue that many households in India face, the deposit rates after adjusting for inflation is very negative in the United States because the inflation rate is close to 7.5% and the federal funds rate is close to 0% right now. Even the bank deposit rates are close to zero, and therefore the effective deposit rate after adjusting for inflation is minus 7.5% in the United States. The other risk, apart from inflation, supply disruptions, and very low returns on bank deposits, one of the redeeming features for the US economy, and also to some extent applies for the Indian economy, is the retail participation. The financial markets have done very well in the last 2 years in many parts of the world, including in India. And not only the metros, but even the smaller towns in India have participated. That has got both a positive dimension and a negative dimension. Positive dimension is, of course, it has cushioned the impact of low income growth in Tier B and Tier C, Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. And it is also compensated for, therefore, lack of income opportunities. So, to some extent, it is keeping the consumption growth at least growing to some extent, if not to the fullest extent. The side is that if the market continues to correct, as it has begun to correct in India as well as in the developed world, this could affect sentiment and further postpone the recovery of consumption demand. And I will come to that because the issues were raised about income inequality, etc. And we will see how these things can be mitigated. So I just wanted to give you a global backdrop. So we are facing a situation. The reason why I presented the global backdrop is that most of us look at Indian situation and we think as if India is facing a unique set of challenges. On the contrary, I would argue that because of the numbers you saw on the inflation data and on the growth forecast, India is compared to other countries, and I'm not saying this is a good answer for every citizen, but by and large, given that the pandemic is a global phenomena and given that the impact is global, supply disruptions are global, and free cost oil prices are global, other countries and other regions are far more adversely affected than we in India are. The Indian economy currently has few positive signs. Activity levels in some industries have crossed the pre-pandemic level, and the budget is for 22-23, which was prepared, and the economic survey also before I joined. The government has clearly taken the view that while it will support the vulnerable sections with Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana through direct benefit transfers, etc., As far as the economic growth is concerned, because the private sector is waiting for consumption to recover before it starts investing vigorously, the government is continuing to make a case for investing on its own, both the union government and the state government. That is why the capital expenditure plans in the budget are quite significantly higher than 21-22. The banking system is stable. Bad loans and assets are lower than expected, including in medium, small, and micro enterprises. And capital is very adequate. And more importantly, we spent the last 10 years in 2011 to 2020 addressing the balance sheet problems in the corporate sector and in the banking sector. And banks have also provided for all the potential bad debts up to 85%, bad and doubtful debts. What does it mean? It means that credit growth is poised for takeoff. Of course, it has not taken off yet. That is because of the uncertainty caused by the pandemic. I think all of us have to remember that the pandemic is a mental cloud that is hanging over the heads of employers, consumers, and as well as businesses wanting to invest. So as and when, and I hope the third wave was the last one, as and when the memory of the pandemic starts to recede from our minds, employers will now make long-term plans for investing, for hiring, and therefore consumers will also see their incomes rise and spend. So many of the things that were discussed in the opening remarks in terms of inequality, etc., I hope it is not something unreasonable, and I hope that growth will be able to address many of those concerns, as was the case between 2003 and 2008 when the Indian economy was growing very strongly. So, the recovery obviously is not uniform in all sectors. Basically, in the service sectors, especially in the contact sectors like hospitality and tourism, and also to some extent construction, because they require a lot of people, the activity levels are yet to come up. And these are some of the sectors are very high employment intense, construction, apparel industry, etc. They are highly employment intensive. And as and when those industries reach their full employment level, naturally, income level in the hands of the lower segments of the population, lower income category of the population will also rise. GST and e-way bill data show that there is a moderate impact of COVID third wave. But the monthly collections of GST have been rising, which is also a good sign that while you might say that some of this is not visible overall in the economy, but let's remember that it is a country of 140 crores. And there will be always a very small or moderate segment of the population that will have to be supported by the government because of the sheer size. And that is why, given the fact that the government was entering into the pandemic after nearly 5-6 years of low growth. Why? That low growth happened because of the financial system was in stress. Corporates were deleveraging, balance sheets had become very big, they had to cut down on debt, and banks had become cautious, they didn't lend. And then if you remember in 2018, IL&FS collapsed, therefore NBFCs also were unable to find banks to refinance them. So we had a banking crisis from 2012 onwards up to 2017, and then 2018 we had IL&FS collapse. So the government, unfortunately, or the economy found itself coming into the pandemic because of the financial system stress. And by the end of the decade, the financial system stress had worked itself out, and I will show you later, but then the pandemic happened. So hopefully, once the pandemic cloud lifts, the fact that we have now a resilient and improved financial system and corporate balance sheets are lean can lead to investment, employment generation, and income growth. And I will show you more slides on that. So, for the time being, therefore, until the private sector steps in, the government wants to keep the economy growing, and that is the reason why capital expenditure as a percentage of total expenditure by the government is filling the void, so to speak. Okay? So, there is a huge pickup in capital expenditure. This year, for example, state governments themselves are spending much faster on capex compared to the year 2021. So, and the government also initially previous year gave 10,000 crores on interest-free loans to states, which was raised to 15,000 crores in 21-22. And for the next financial year, this has been increased to 1 lakh crores. And this will be a 50-year interest-free loan given to states. The borrowing will be done by the union government and the state government. Whoever is not, it's optional, it is not compulsory. They can borrow this money if they want to invest in capital assets, which will generate employment. Okay, so this is actually not only the union government, but the state governments can also add to the overall capital expenditure without waiting for the private sector to step up, which will happen once the pandemic cloud is lifted. This is what I mentioned earlier. The NPA problems were there until 2017-18, and then later on it has been coming down, but then we had the NBFC crisis. But right now the banks are very adequately capitalized. The capital to risk-weighted asset ratio is at a very all-time high in the last 12-13 years, and that should basically provide the basis for credit growth to happen once the current uncertainties recede or fade away. We talked about the bank credit growth. It is still only around less than double-digit growth rate. Back in 2003 to 8, we were growing at 20-25%. Of course, that created a lot of problems later, but we have definitely scope for credit growth to improve to around 8 to 10% or even 10 to 12%. Clearly, the sectors that are growing are personal loans as well as agriculture allied activities. Services are picking up. Industry loans to industry are still growing somewhat moderately, partly for the reasons I discussed earlier. I spoke about the favorable preconditions for investment growth, corporate profitability, low lending rates in real terms, and deleveraged balance sheets, profit margins. These are all the favorable preconditions that are currently existing. So, and these, you should be reasonably confident and hopeful that this will actually lead to, at least if not the full extent of the capital investment boom we witnessed back in 2003 and 2008, at least 50 to 60% of that capital investment boom that happened in that period will play itself out once the pandemic concerns recede. The same slide, we are only adding additional factors such as the PLI, and there are anecdotal evidence that countries are looking at China plus one strategy, and India is that option, other option to China. And then open and transparent bidding in infrastructure sectors, and therefore demand expected to pick up is an incentive for the private sector to kick in. The non-financial corporate debt is down from 65% down to 52.9% of GDP. What the companies have borrowed, they have become leaner and meaner, and we can see that many of the on the right hand side, many of the companies that actually make capital goods equipment, their order book in the first half of this financial year has been doing quite well. And in addition to that, import of capital goods is rising quite rapidly, and that's also a good sign that industry is importing capital goods. In fact, India's imports have been rising, both oil as well as non-imports. But even excluding oil and jewelry imports, which India does import quite a bit, the capital goods import growth rate, which is the green line, the thick green line, is rising, which is a good sign that industry is willing to consider investing in capital assets. And the infrastructure push, I spoke about the employment intensity of investments and private spending. We know that construction is an important sector for employment generation. And because of the pandemic concerns and the inability to attract people to come into construction industry in the urban areas, because many people migrated back to their villages due to the pandemic, and once that comes back, construction industry will grow, and that will lead to employment and the income growth, addressing some of the inequality concerns that have arisen in the last 2 years. It is not a surprise, therefore, the current situation, consumer confidence, RBI data shows consumers are still very cautious. Memories fade only slowly because the pandemic second wave shock was very strong because of personal experiences of many people with the virus. And therefore, it is not a surprise that consumer confidence is a bit low. I keep repeating myself, it is not so much that the underlying economy is doing badly, it is the sentiment and the fear psychosis caused by the pandemic and restrictions on movement, lockdowns, etc. This has to lift from people's minds for us to see a growth spurt in personal income and personal spending and employment generation. At least in some sectors which are not so much affected by the pandemic because they can work from home, the global information technology spending is rising, and India's IT sector is booming and hiring as well. And some of you might have noticed that the IT companies' total combined turnover has crossed $200 billion. So that's a bright spot. And the reason is not that we understand that IT sector is employing skilled people, and what we are talking about in lower income population, which may not be highly skilled or literate. I understand that. But what I'm trying to point out here is that the pickup in the IT sector is a sign that basically it is the pandemic that is playing a big role here. The reason why IT sector progress is happening is that you can do work from home. Whereas in many of the contact-based services, whether it is mass tourism, whether it is construction, etc., you have to have people on the ground. And that is the reason why many of the statistics that were cited in 2019-20 and 2020-21 and even in 21-22 are very much impacted by the pandemic rather than by any underlying economic concerns or weakness. And many of the high frequency indicators are showing service sector growth. You can see here, and very few sectors have negative growth, especially tourist arrivals, international air passenger traffic, and three-wheeler sales, etc., which is again partly due to the urban consumer caution that is showing up in the three-wheeler sales and also in the tourism sectors, mainly air passenger traffic and domestic passenger traffic. This is a comparison compared to other countries which have dark red and pink colors in terms of performance. India is uniformly better performing. As you move towards the right, the light gray and the darker shades of gray, performance is better. Again, this may not be a consolation for many people, but we have to understand that this is not a unique situation, but a situation that is faced both by developed and developing countries as well. Temporarily, of course, we are seeing interest rates in the Indian bond market rising. But one thing I can tell you is that the budget has been done in a very conservative manner. There was a feeling that the budget hasn't provided for the vulnerable segments of the population. That is not quite true, because the Rural Employment Guarantee Program is a demand-driven program. As in when people want rural employment, they are provided, and that is why last year, for example, in 21-22, for the current financial year, the revised estimates are higher than the budgeted estimates. Next year, the budgeted estimates are going to be are lower under the expectation that this would be that there would be a normal recovery in the economy, and therefore demand for rural employment guarantee program will be lower. But as if the situation is such that there is a demand for rural employment guarantee program, it will be provided. And the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, which has been providing food over and above the public distribution system allowance, is continuing up to March, and a decision will be taken on its extension. And then if you look at the direct benefit transfers, they have been rising as well, and fund for the Prime Minister's Farmer Income Support Program. So in many respects, and then we have the Affordable Home PM Awas Yojana and the Jal Jeevan Mission are contributing to providing the basic necessities of life for the rural income, for the lower income population. And one of the points mentioned about income inequality or wealth inequality is that in the United States, for example, this is a much bigger problem. But most of the data that you reported and is also mentioned in the media do not take into account government transfers. So the data that is reported is pre-transfer data. post government support programs, inequality is not calculated. That is why this issue becomes a very politically sensitive and highly contested issue, because most of the data is presented before taking into consideration the taxes paid, and before transfers are taken into consideration. If both adjustments are made, the inequality numbers will not look as extreme or as concerning as it appears at first glance. Uh, India's debt sustainability, because our interest rates are still below the economy growth rates, it should not be a concern. Therefore, government bond yields will not spike out of control, leading to higher cost of capital for businesses. That concern is very, very remote. At the same time, I will basically acknowledge the fact that given what is happening in Ukraine and given the United States financial market, which is expensive, and therefore there are concerns with respect to growth rates, there are concerns with respect to inflation, because we are in a very uncertain world. To say that the world is uncertain is nothing is stating the obvious. But what is important to acknowledge is that the uncertainty degree is much higher now because of the pandemic and because of geopolitical tensions and because what is happening to internal social divisions in many parts of the developed world. We just don't know. There are multiple variables and multiple scenarios. The good news is that, at least partially, the government's budget has taken very cautious assumptions with respect to revenue growth, with respect to GDP growth, and therefore there is some room to absorb higher oil prices for some time. There is some room to absorb the inflation rate or even lower tax collection without running a higher deficit and therefore leading to higher interest rates. So there are some buffers to the extent possible that could be done, has been done. And support is being provided to targeted segments of the population, which the technology allows these days. It can be targeted better than, let's say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And transfers are playing a very big role in mitigating inequality. The pandemic concerns, once they recede, contact industries like construction and tourism should return. Once consumption comes back, once the pandemic concerns go away, consumption comes back, private sector is well positioned to invest, banks are well capitalized to lend. So hopefully we will see the visible evidence of all these things happening in the second half of the next financial year. So these are all the risk buffers that are provided for in our various budget as well as GDP calculations. So we have basically, even if the crude oil price remains very high and Indian GDP is affected, I have a feeling that our calculations, our budget assumptions already have provided to a considerable extent for any potential setback to next year's GDP growth coming from the higher oil price. So overall, I would like to leave you with the thought, even though there are many concerns in our heads, I would like to leave you with the thought, and my own personal nature is to be always conservative and cautious, but I do believe, honestly, that the Indian economic story is a story of glass that is more than half full. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nageswaran. And now I request our members to have interaction with Dr. Nageswaran. If you have any queries or any observations. And first of all, I request Mr. Naresh Pachisia to give his observations or raise a question.
Thank you, Mr. Nageswaran. It was, given the fact about today's developments, given today's developments, your presentation on Indian economy was very, very reassuring, and we do stand out in the global community. That's the best part. However, talking of today, it may be a little bit too early still. What could be, in your opinion, the impact on, the global and Indian macroeconomic situation, if this were what has happened in Europe prevails or escalates. And how do you think India should respond to it? And one particular aspect to it is that, uh, you know, uh, in government's estimates, oil was priced in at $75 and it's crossed 100 today. So, given this, what's your quick take on global macroeconomic, Indian macroeconomic situation, and how should be India responding to this?
So, how should India respond on the diplomatic front is something I would not be able to answer. It is better left to the experts in the foreign ministry. As far as the impact is concerned, as I mentioned, we have to wait and see how persistent the current high oil price is. And I did allude to the fact that our budget, the assumption for nominal GDP growth next year is 11.1%. If you take an inflation rate of 4%, then the real GDP growth assumed is closer to 7%. RBI expects 7.8. So we are actually lower than the lowest estimate available in terms of the budget assumption. And the high foreign exchange reserves that we have, also the import cover, all these things give us a degree of comfort and cushion. But yes, there will be an impact. But to quantify that impact, we have to wait and see how long the current spell of high oil price lasts and how high it goes. Both the duration and the magnitude of the oil price both have to be watched before we can make precise estimates. It will still be imprecise. Estimates of impact on GDP growth, current account deficit, inflation rate, etc. But right now, all I can say is, at the moment, assuming that it lasts for a month or two and not more than that, because as you know very well historically, high oil price is the cure for high oil price, because naturally it dampens demand, and because it dampens demand, then the prices drop. So 75 is the assumption made for the entire financial year 22-23. It can still be a right assumption. So it is too premature to be able to talk about orders of magnitude.
Thank you.
Mr. Saurabh Khemani.
Sir, good afternoon. After a very erudite presentation which you made, the finance minister this time put a 30% tax on the virtual currency, cryptocurrency, whatever we may call it. What is your take on it? Has she legalized it? What's happening? The general public is a bit confused, because in the days to come, we have also said that there will be a digital rupee, other things will happen. So what is your take, sir?
No, I will have nothing more to add to the clarifications issued by the Revenue Secretary in this regard, that the taxation of the cryptocurrency, crypto assets and its legalization are two separate things. I have nothing more to add.
So,
Any other member who would like to ask something or have his observations?
May
Yes, Mr.
I join in?
Yes, Mr. Chandra, please.
My question to Mr. Nageswaran, the Prime Minister's vision of $5 trillion economy. Now, if we see the current contribution of agriculture to the GDP is about 17%, which has risen to 20%, I think, last year. How much do you, as the advisor, how much do you think the increase in the agriculture sector needed to reach that $5 trillion economy?
The world over, the experience of development is that the share of agriculture does indeed come down, because of the fact that, as human beings raise their income levels, they consume other things. Consumption share of food consumption share of your basket will naturally come down, because as incomes rise, people spend on other leisure goods. Maybe they go for vacations, they buy some consumer durables, or buy some vehicles, etc. So agriculture growth as a share of GDP need not necessarily have to rise in a big way for this number to be achieved. What needs to be increased is the manufacturing share of GDP, and that is still possible. I mean, if you look at the global trade in services, that is growing and India already has a decent advantage in services. It is the manufacturing that needs to pick up. And that is the reason why the production-linked incentive schemes are concentrating on 14 different manufacturing sectors. And therefore, it is, and also with this Gati Shakti dashboard, which reduces logistics and transportation costs, enabling manufactured goods to come to the port cities and be exported. So the key is to raise the manufacturing share of GDP, because we have something like 17 to 18% for agriculture. Overall, industry is about 22, 24%, and the balance about 55, 56% is for services sector. We need to have a mix of probably close to 20, 30, and 50, and that would be ideal, and that would be one of the important building blocks for the $5 trillion.
May I add one more question to this?
Yes, Mr.
My question is, if that is so, but then India being having almost 5 times the arable land of Holland, but our agricultural export is one. There are potentials for post-harvest industry.
No, we speak about the share of GDP. So if India is...
Don't we have a vision for that?
No, we have. I think that is why I think the program of, Kisan credit cards or the Prime Minister's income support for Krishi Kalyan, all these things are, and as well as the liberalization of the farm laws, which had to be temporarily abated, are meant to increase the choices for our farmers to diversify out of staples. And as you might have seen, farm exports have hit a level of $50 billion was the headline today. So there is room. I didn't say the agricultural sector will not rise. Let's remember, we discussed share of GDP. If GDP rises to $5 trillion, and even if your share of agriculture remains constant at 17% or 18%, as you put it, as a share of $5 trillion, it will be close to $1 trillion by itself. So there will be absolute growth rates in the agricultural sector. What I said was, as economies become more advanced, the share of agriculture will necessarily fall. I didn't say share of agricultural exports will fall.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else, please? Now I request Mr. Saurabh Khemani to give vote of thanks.
Thank you, Mr. President. It was indeed a very learning experience, and Dr. Nageswaran has put to rest many of the questions. Although the clouds are still dark, but I think there is a silver lining. With oil and other things, and with the Ukraine-Russia, all these situations looming on our heads, the business sentiment again has dampened, and the financial markets are not performing well. But nevertheless, with all the clarifications today, we can move forward with a new vigor, and we look forward that our economy will perform better than what has been budgeted and, the growth that has been planned. So may I request all of you to join me with the acclamation for giving a hearty vote of thanks to Dr. Nageswaran. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. As you correctly put it, we all hope that we can put the pandemic cloud to rest and it will dissipate and we will see bluer skies in 22-23. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. All the very best.
Thank you, Dr. Nageswaran. I would like to extend an invitation for a physical interaction when we can have in Kolkata. It would be our invitation to you at your convenience. Yeah. Please do visit our chamber and let's have physical interaction with you.
Yeah, it will be my pleasure to accept the invitation and be able to travel there to meet with you all physically. I hope it happens sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.